January 22, 1943. The bitter cold of the Eastern Front cut through every layer of uniform, seeping into the bones of soldiers who had already endured months of relentless combat. Snow blanketed the ruins of Stalingrad, turning the devastated city into a ghostly landscape where twisted steel and shattered bricks jutted out like skeletal fingers. Yet, amidst this frozen hell, life, or what remained of it, persisted stubbornly. Second Lieutenant John George, barely 24, huddled inside a makeshift bunker with his squad. The air was heavy with the scent of smoke and wet wool. Outside, the distant thumps of artillery echoed through the streets, punctuating the eerie silence that followed each barrage. John's hands were raw and red from the cold, his face smeared with grime and fatigue, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the crumbling buildings for any movement. "Lieutenant," whispered Private Harris, breaking the silence. "The Russians, they're moving closer. I can hear them." John nodded without turning. "Stay low. Don't make a sound. Remember your training." His voice was steady, though the tension in his jaw betrayed the storm of anxiety within. For weeks, they had been cut off from the main unit, surviving on meager rations scavenged from abandoned stores and the occasional supply drop that often never arrived. Each day was a fight not just against the enemy, but against hunger, frostbite, and despair. He had learned quickly that fear could be both a curse and a tool, paralyzing for some, motivating for others. Suddenly, a shell exploded nearby, shaking the ground beneath them. Dust and snow rained down over the bunker, and Harris let out a startled cry. John grabbed his shoulder, forcing him to stay low. "Focus. We need to move at first light." As night fell, John crawled out of the bunker to scout the area. The city was unrecognizable, a shadow of its former self. Once bustling streets were now silent corridors of death, littered with the remnants of war, discarded weapons, broken helmets, and the occasional frozen body. Every step was a risk. He could feel the eyes of unseen enemies tracking his movements. In a destroyed square, he found a small group of civilians huddled together, their faces pale and hollow, eyes wide with fear. Children clutched at ragged blankets, and women whispered prayers under their breath. John's heart ached, but there was no time for sentiment. He offered a brief nod of reassurance, then disappeared back into the shadows. The following morning, the squad received orders. A counterattack was imminent. Their objective was to hold a strategically vital factory on the northern edge of the city, a position that could turn the tide of this sector. The factory loomed ahead like a fortress of twisted metal and smoke-stained walls. John knew that many would not return. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, heavier than his rifle or pack. As they advanced, the first waves of Russian soldiers appeared in the distance. Smoke from burning buildings clouded the sky, casting everything in an unnatural gray light. John's squad took cover behind the remnants of a collapsed wall, waiting for the right moment to strike. The sound of gunfire erupted suddenly, cutting through the cold morning air, and chaos descended. John moved with precision, barking orders, checking corners, and ensuring his men stayed alive. Every decision carried a life-or-death consequence. He saw comrades fall beside him, their faces etched with shock and pain. Time seemed to slow in those moments, each heartbeat a deafening drum in his ears. By evening, the squad had reached the factory gates, but victory was far from certain. The structure was heavily fortified, and they were low on ammunition. John knew the coming days would test not just their physical endurance, but their very humanity. Yet, beneath the fear and exhaustion, a spark of determination burned. They would fight. They had no choice. As night fell again, John sat on the cold ground, staring at the stars obscured by smoke and ash. He thought of home, of family, and the life that felt like a distant memory. The war had a way of stripping everything familiar away, leaving only survival and duty. But even here, in the heart of destruction, he found a strange clarity. This was what it meant to live, to fight, and to endure. The first part of John George's story ends with the world around him in ruins, yet inside him, a resilience that refused to be extinguished. The storm is coming, and the next days would push him and his squad to the very edge of human endurance. The morning of January 23, 1943, broke with a deafening roar. The horizon was lit by distant explosions as artillery shells carved the landscape into fire and smoke. The northern factory, their designated stronghold, now stood as a fragile outpost against the relentless advance of Russian forces. John George and his squad had barely slept, exhaustion etched deep into their faces, but the weight of duty left no room for rest. Inside the factory, the air was thick with soot and gunpowder. Machinery, once vital for producing engines and steel, now lay twisted and silent. Broken windows allowed the cold wind to cut through the building, adding frostbite to the list of dangers outside the constant threat of bullets. John moved silently through the corridors, checking his men, distributing the last rounds of ammunition, and preparing defenses. "Lieutenant, they're pushing the east wall," whispered Private Harris, voice trembling. His eyes were wide, reflecting fear that John had tried to suppress in himself. John's gaze swept over the approaching figures, Soviet soldiers moving with disciplined determination, their weapons raised, their breaths visible in the freezing air. "Hold your positions. Do not let them take the factory," John barked, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade. The battle erupted suddenly, like a storm unleashed. Bullets tore through the walls, ricocheting and shredding wood and metal alike. The air filled with the deafening symphony of war, explosions shouting, and the sickening thud of bodies falling. John ducked behind a support beam, firing at the advancing soldiers with precision born from months of combat. Every shot carried the weight of survival, every miss a potential death. Hours passed in a blur of smoke and chaos. Harris was struck in the shoulder, screaming as John dragged him to cover. "Stay with me, Harris. You're not dying here," John shouted, pressing a makeshift bandage over the wound. Around them, comrades fell one by one, some crying out, some silent, their faces frozen in shock. The factory walls became a tomb for the unprepared and unlucky, while the remaining soldiers fought desperately for every inch of ground. By mid-afternoon, John realized they were running out of options. Ammunition was nearly gone, and reinforcements were nowhere in sight. The Russians were pressing harder, exploiting weak points in the building's defenses. With no time to mourn, John made a decision. They would have to evacuate to the basement and mount a final stand from there. As they retreated through the factory's bowels, they found themselves in a maze of old machinery and storage rooms. John's heart sank when he saw Private Milligan, one of his closest friends, lying motionless beneath a collapsed support beam. The squad could do nothing but cover him and move on. John clenched his jaw, the weight of loss pressing down like the cold steel around them. The basement provided temporary safety, but it was far from secure. The enemy began to shell the building, shaking the ground violently. Dust and debris fell from the ceiling, and the echoes of destruction seemed to seep into the walls themselves. In this confined, suffocating space, fear became almost tangible, coiling around each man like a living thing. John knew he had to maintain control. "We survive together or we die alone," he yelled. His words were not just commands. They were a lifeline, a reminder that despair could be fought with unity and courage. Harris, bandaged but determined, nodded fiercely. Others clutched their rifles with white-knuckled resolve. Through the night, the battle continued above them. Explosions rocked the building, shaking the basement floor and sending shivers down their spines. John listened to the sounds of war and thought of the civilians still trapped in the city, of families hiding behind ruined walls. Every life lost here, every sacrifice made, felt like a ripple in a larger storm, a storm whose end seemed impossibly distant. As dawn approached, a tense silence settled over the ruins. The Russians had pulled back, but only temporarily. John emerged from the basement cautiously, surveying the destruction. The factory was barely standing, walls riddled with holes, smoke curling from shattered roofs. His squad had survived, but at a cost. Several friends were gone, their bodies now silent testimonies to the brutality of war. John's mind was heavy with the responsibility of command. Every decision, every order, carried consequences that could not be undone. Yet even amidst this horror, he felt a grim sense of resolve. They had endured the worst of the storm today, but tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, and perhaps new losses. The sun rose, weak and pale, behind clouds of smoke, casting long shadows over the ruined city. John stood amidst the wreckage, exhausted, wounded in spirit, but unbroken. The fire and ash of the past day had scarred them all, but it had also forged a deeper bond between the survivors. In the distance, the muffled sounds of war continued, an unending reminder that Stalingrad and the war itself would not yield easily. And as John looked over his squad, he realized that survival was only the beginning. To endure this war was to confront the limits of human courage, and he was only just beginning that journey. By the end of January 24, 1943, the city of Stalingrad had become a labyrinth of fire, rubble, and death. The northern factory, once a symbol of strategic defense, now stood as a battered relic amid the frozen carnage. John George and his squad had survived the first major onslaught, but the war was far from over. Exhaustion weighed heavily on them, and morale was dangerously thin. That morning, a messenger arrived from a neighboring Allied unit, bringing news that chilled John to the bone. "Reinforcements they're delayed," the young soldier stammered, snow clinging to his ragged coat. "Orders were changed. Command says hold at all costs." John clenched his jaw. Holding meant more than surviving. It meant facing another relentless wave of enemy soldiers with dwindling ammunition and shattered spirits. Yet, worse news was soon to follow. Reports of a possible leak in their defensive plans suggested that someone within the Allied ranks had betrayed them. The idea was almost unthinkable. To be attacked by the enemy is one thing. To be undermined from within is a poison far deadlier. As John gathered his men, tension crackled in the cold air. "Listen carefully," he said, voice steady but grim. "Someone has been feeding information to the enemy. I don't know who yet, but we must assume anyone could be involved. Trust your instincts, cover each other, and stay alert." The squad moved cautiously, every corridor and street approached with meticulous care. John noticed subtle signs of sabotage. Explosives placed in odd locations, supply crates emptied or tampered with, messages intercepted by the enemy. Fear of betrayal added a psychological weight to the physical dangers surrounding them. By mid-morning, Russian forces launched another fierce attack. This time, the assault was coordinated, almost surgical, as if someone knew exactly where the squad would be weakest. John and his men fought with grim determination, repelling attack after attack, while the bitter wind cut through their uniforms. Each soldier's breath came in clouds of ice, mingling with the smoke and dust of battle. During a tense firefight near the factory's collapsed east wing, John noticed Private Harris moving strangely, hesitating as if unsure where to fire. Suspicion pricked at him, but there was no time for confrontation. An explosion ripped through the wall beside them, sending debris flying. John barely shielded Harris with his own body, saving his life, but the doubt lingered, gnawing at him. As night fell, the squad retreated to an abandoned office within the factory to regroup. The room smelled of damp paper, gun oil, and the faint trace of blood. John pored over maps and reports, trying to pinpoint the source of the leak. He realized that the betrayal was not just a minor act. It was a calculated attempt to weaken their defenses before a decisive blow. Hours later, a figure emerged from the shadows, a Russian deserter who had surrendered to John's squad during the first assault. He carried news. A spy within their ranks had been passing details of troop movements, and the next wave would target their exact positions. The man's eyes darted nervously, and he spoke in a low, urgent tone. "They know everything. I tried to stop them, but—" John's mind raced. Who among his comrades could betray them? Every familiar face now carried the shadow of doubt. He realized the only way to survive was to trust skill over suspicion, strategy over fear. Orders were given. They would set traps, create false positions, and prepare for the enemy's expected moves. That night, the squad moved like ghosts through the ruined factory, laying improvised explosives and fortifying positions. Each action required precision and courage. Private Milligan, who had survived earlier injuries, worked tirelessly, setting barricades and clearing paths. Harris, though shaken, followed John's every command with renewed resolve. The bond between survivors was tested, but their shared desperation strengthened their unity. Just before dawn, the Russians struck again. This time, John's traps worked brilliantly. Explosions ripped through the attacking forces, and the squad's clever maneuvers allowed them to take advantage of the chaos. Yet, amidst the victory, John could not ignore the gnawing fear. The enemy's knowledge of their positions meant that betrayal was still at large, and tomorrow could bring an even deadlier assault. As the day ended, John stood at the edge of the factory roof, looking over the ruined city. Stalingrad was a frozen wasteland, and the shadows of betrayal hung over every corner. He felt the bitter truth. The war was not just a battle against soldiers in uniform, but against fear, doubt, and the darkness that could fester within even the closest allies. John George knew one thing for certain. Survival required more than courage. It required vigilance, cunning, and a willingness to confront the shadows lurking in every heart, including his own. January 25, 1943. The city of Stalingrad had become a frozen nightmare. Each street was a graveyard, each building a fortress of despair. John George and his squad were exhausted, running on the fringes of hunger and frostbite, yet they could not stop. The northern factory, once their stronghold, now stood as a fragile island in a sea of devastation. The morning brought grim news. Russian forces were planning a coordinated assault to finally overrun the factory. Intelligence from the deserter hinted that the enemy had reinforced their numbers and was prepared for a final strike. John gathered his men in the basement once again, the walls trembling with distant artillery. We are outnumbered, outgunned, and the enemy knows our positions. But we survive. We fight. And we hold this line, whatever it takes, he said, voice steady despite the storm raging outside. The squad moved out to fortify their positions. Every step was a gamble. Every corner could hide death. In the narrow hallways, John's men set traps, stacked debris for cover, and prepared for what might be their final stand. The factory, scarred and hollowed by repeated attacks, became their battlefield and their prison. But survival came at a cost beyond bullets and bombs. As the night approached, John faced the hardest decision yet. A group of wounded civilians had been discovered hiding in the basement, men, women, and children, starving and frostbitten. Bringing them to the upper floors would slow the squad and risk exposure. Leaving them meant condemning innocent lives. John's eyes met Harris's, then Milligan's. The weight of command pressed down like a frozen hand on his chest. We save them, John finally said. If we lose our humanity, we've already lost the war. Moving the civilians through ruined corridors under enemy fire was a nightmare. Every step brought new danger. Bullets tore into walls. An explosion sent clouds of dust and debris into the air. Milligan carried a child on his back, while Harris shielded an elderly woman with his own body. John led the way, rifle ready, scanning for movement, his mind calculating, reacting, surviving. As they neared the basement exit, the first wave of the Russian assault hit. Soldiers poured into the factory with relentless fury, their weapons cutting through the cold air. The squad fought with everything they had, their courage a fragile barrier against overwhelming odds. Harris took a bullet to the leg, but refused to slow down, crawling to cover while helping the civilians. Milligan fired relentlessly, the child on his back trembling with fear. In the chaos, John spotted the traitor, the same figure whose betrayal had guided the Russian attacks. Private Sanderson, another officer in the unit, tried to escape amidst the fighting. Rage and disbelief surged through John. Sanderson, get down, he shouted, but it was too late. Sanderson disappeared into the smoke, leaving death and destruction behind him. John knew there would be no mercy, no forgiveness. The battle raged for hours. Traps set by the squad inflicted casualties on the enemy, but the overwhelming numbers pushed them to the brink. At one point, the floor above collapsed, sending debris crashing into the hallway. Milligan narrowly escaped, but Harris was trapped under rubble. With no time to spare, John lifted the beam himself, freeing his friend just before another explosion rocked the building. By dawn, the attack had subsided. The factory stood, battered but unbroken. The squad survived, though several members were wounded and morale was strained to the breaking point. The civilians, though frightened and weak, were alive. John's decisions as leadership and the unyielding courage of his men had saved lives against impossible odds. But victory was bittersweet. The war had stripped away innocence, replacing it with a constant awareness of mortality and betrayal. John stood atop the factory, looking out at the ruins of Stalingrad. Smoke and ash painted the horizon in shades of gray and orange. The city had survived another night, but the cost had been enormous. John George understood with painful clarity that survival was more than holding a building. It was about protecting the vulnerable, facing betrayal without losing trust entirely, and finding courage in moments when hope seemed absent. As he surveyed the destruction, he knew the final battle was still ahead. The city and the war itself would demand more from them than ever before. But in the quiet aftermath, amidst the fire and ruin, John and his squad found a fleeting sense of resilience. They had fought, they had survived, and they had preserved their humanity, for now. The edge of humanity had been tested, and they had not fallen. But the shadow of what was yet to come loomed larger than ever. January 26, 1943. The city of Stalingrad lay in ruins, a frozen graveyard of fire, steel, and ash. For John George and the remnants of his squad, survival had become a daily battle against not only the enemy, but against despair, exhaustion, and the creeping sense that the war might never end. Yet even in the midst of devastation, a mission remained. Hold the factory, protect the civilians, and endure whatever fate awaited them. That morning, the Russians launched their final, overwhelming assault. Unlike previous attacks, this one was coordinated with precision, striking from multiple directions, and exploiting every weak point in the factory's defenses. The roar of artillery was deafening, shaking the ground like an earthquake. Windows shattered, walls crumbled, and smoke filled every corridor. The squad, already battered and weary, braced for the fight that could very well be their last. John led the defense with unwavering determination, moving from position to position, directing fire, and keeping his men focused. Every decision carried life-or-death consequences. He watched as soldiers who had become like brothers to him fell one by one. Harris, who had survived previous battles, was struck down by sniper fire. Milligan, his loyal friend, was badly wounded while shielding civilians from a collapsing wall. Grief and anger surged through John, fueling his resolve. Amid the chaos, John realized the factory could not hold indefinitely. Supplies were nearly gone, ammunition was exhausted, and the enemy had broken through sections of the building. Retreat was impossible. Any attempt to flee would result in certain death for both the squad and the civilians they protected. The choice was clear. They would make their last stand inside the heart of the factory. The remaining squad members positioned themselves strategically, using every scrap of cover and every improvised weapon at their disposal. Civilians huddled in hidden rooms, clutching one another, praying silently for survival. John's voice, strong and commanding, cut through the noise. We fight not just for ourselves, but for those who cannot fight. Hold your ground. The battle reached a fever pitch. Explosions shook the factory, flames consumed sections of the building, and smoke choked the corridors. The squad fought like men possessed, buying time and inflicting heavy losses on the enemy. Every fallen comrade was a dagger in John's heart, but retreating was not an option. Survival was not just about escaping. It was about standing for what was right, even in the face of inevitable death. As the enemy breached the final corridor, John made a desperate decision. He led a charge, using hand grenades and rifles to push back the advancing soldiers. In the melee, he confronted Sanderson, the traitor whose betrayal had caused so much death. Their fight was brutal hand-to-hand, amidst falling debris and fire. John prevailed, but not without cost. Sanderson's last act set off an explosion nearby, injuring John severely and throwing him across the ruined floor. When John regained consciousness, the factory was silent. The enemy had retreated, leaving behind bodies and destruction. The surviving squad members had rallied, using the chaos to force the Russians to fall back. John, battered and bloodied, rose with great effort. Around him, the surviving civilians emerged from hiding, fragile and shaken, yet alive. The morning sun rose over Stalingrad, weak and pale through the smoke. John George surveyed the city, burned-out streets, shattered buildings, frozen corpses, and the quiet, haunting remnants of war. He knew the victory was temporary. The war was far from over. But in that moment, a sense of grim triumph filled him. They had survived impossible odds, protected the innocent, and faced betrayal and death without surrendering their humanity. John's squad, now smaller but unbroken in spirit, gathered around him. Their eyes reflected exhaustion, grief, and relief. They had lost much, but they had endured. And as the echoes of battle faded into the cold morning, John understood the true cost of war, not just the lives lost, but the resilience, courage, and sacrifices required to preserve even a fragment of hope. The city remained a shadow of its former self, yet in the hearts of those who survived, there was a spark that could not be extinguished. Stalingrad had tested them to the limits of endurance, morality, and courage. And as John George looked toward the horizon, he knew that even in the darkest times, humanity could endure, and that the echoes of their struggle would live on long after the war ended. The story of survival, sacrifice, and resilience in the heart of Stalingrad concluded, leaving behind lessons of courage, loyalty, and the enduring strength of the human spirit.